Oh, I'm your host, Rob. Welcome to the dungeon. Today, for the first time ever on my channel, I'm pleased to have a special guest, none other than Chris from Treantmonk's Temple. I'm sure most of you know who you are, or who he is, but, in case my mom watches this video, or the two other people who may not know, please introduce yourself, Chris.
Sure, yeah. So I'm Chris. I run the YouTube channel, Treantmonk's Temple, and the channel is devoted to optimization mainly, and then rules analysis as well.
Excellent. So, as I was mentioning when we first started chatting here, I kind of first discovered you on message board forums. Somebody linked your guide to being a god wizards part 1 and 2, which is what I first discovered. And then I discovered your YouTube channel later, which was pretty exciting for me because you had a lot of great content. Well, I still do. It's not like it was a one-time thing. Yeah, so I've been a big fan of yours for quite some time now. And obviously you're not just specializing in wizards. Obviously, you know the game in its entirety very, very well. But I've been doing wizards lately because I've been kind of going through other classes, and, as luck would have it, we just got to wizards. When I first reached out to you, I think I was doing, like, rogues or something. But I was still planning on talking to you about wizards anyway because, screw rogues. But as it happens, because you were moving from one side of the country to the other, and we kind of had to push things back a bit, it just so happened that this fell when I was doing wizards. So who better to talk to you about wizards than the writer of the God Wizard Guide? So I'm very pleased to have you here.
Well, thank you very much.
So I'm sure you're probably sick of telling this story by now, but for the viewers who may not be familiar, where did you first come up with the concept of the God Wizard, and what is the God Wizard?
Yeah, I guess I'll start with what it is. Basically, it is the idea that, and this is a little old-fashioned, but if we look at earlier editions, when I saw wizards played, and when I played them, it was largely about when can I get Fireball.
Yes.
And then you cast Fireball, and then you run out of slots, and then you wait until you can cast Fireball again. Mm-hmm. And the idea was that you could do the big damage over a big area. And what I noticed is, especially, I guess it's partially due to me just getting older and looking at things a little more thoroughly, but it might have also been the system as well. But I noticed around 3rd edition to 3.5 that there were just a lot more options for wizards that were probably better than the damage options, because the damage options became less effective as the editions went on. Like in first edition, Fireball killed everything, and by 3.5, then it did moderate damage to a number of things.
Yes.
So it felt like they were becoming less effective at what I expected them to do, and I had been kind of looking at other spell options for them because, of course, they have a million spells, and I started to think, I think that maybe I've missed the boat here. Maybe the best thing a wizard can do isn't damage. Maybe the best thing they can do are other things. And I had joined a campaign with a friend of mine, with a bunch of people I didn't know. He was the DM, but the other players I had never met before. And I was joining a campaign that had already been going. And he told me that they weren't doing very well, that the campaign was really difficult, and that maybe I should come in and bring an optimized character. I asked him what kind of character would work best with the group. I didn't know what anyone was playing. And he suggested that a fighter would suit the group the best. In 3.5, there was kind of one way to build an optimized fighter, and that was the Goliath with fighter, and you took a couple levels of Totem Barbarian, I forget, Lion Totem Barbarian, I think, and you build this charge build, and it can just multiply its damage multiple times. 3.5 is notorious for having a lot of routes to specifically optimized the difference between optimized characters and non-optimized characters was much, much larger than it is in 5th edition.
I actually think that's to 5th edition's credit, to be honest.
Oh, for sure. 100%.
Yeah.
So I went to this group, again, didn't know any of the players, introduced my character, and there was another player at the table who was also playing a Goliath fighter. And my original assumption is he would have the same build.
Yeah, or
to my horror, I discovered that nobody had optimized their characters. So they were playing non-optimized 3.5 characters. And we went into a combat, and he went and did his thing. He swung his long sword, added his strength to damage. And then it's my turn, and then I do the charge, and then, I multiply the damage many, many times, and I did like 10 times more damage than him. And it was kind of horrifying because, the entire group was just not expecting this. They obviously were not familiar with optimization and what could be done in 3.5. And what I really felt bad about is that, this other player, this poor guy, he's got his character, and now his character basically is not contributing anymore in any meaningful way. And, I went through the session, but I was just devastated by the way this was working out, and I'm thinking these guys all have to hate me. And I left the session, drove home, and I was honestly considering just quitting because it had not been fun. And then I called, or I emailed the DM, and I told him, this isn't good. What would you think if I just made a different character that, isn't overshadowing anyone? And he said, that's probably a good idea. Because I assume they were talking about me after I left, because I was the first one to go. And so I had to think about it, because I thought what I could do is I could just make a crappy character and come back, and then I'd fit in.
Yes.
But I am an optimizer at heart. I wanted to figure out how to make an effective character, but I didn't want to step on anyone's toes. And what I discovered is, by looking at the wizard spells, is that you can make a wizard that doesn't do anything directly. Everything they do just makes everybody else better. Mm-hmm. And I thought, if I do that, then they're still the stars. I'm not overshadowing anyone, but I'm going to make them way more effective. And so I made this character that didn't do any damage at all, brought it in. They all thought it sucked. They were astounded I hadn't taken Fireball.
Yeah. What other spell would you need, Chris?
Yeah, and so we did the combats, and what I did is I buffed them. I teleported them when they needed to be teleported. Mm-hmm. I did battlefield control. I raised walls, terrain, that kind of stuff. Never doing actual damage to the enemy. And they went in and they did all the damage. And they did a lot more damage, and they took a lot less damage. And also, I was able to make it so that when enemies would normally, focus in on one character and down them, I was able to interfere so that they couldn't really do that. So the damage ended up being more spread out. Mm-hmm. And characters stopped dying in that campaign. And by the end of the campaign, no other character had died the entire time. And I had felt like I was making tactical decisions, and it was a lot of fun. And at the end, they still all thought the character I had made was not contributing. They didn't recognize the difference it had made, and I really liked that because I knew, and it just confirmed to me that my objective of not overshadowing anyone had exceeded all my expectations.
They didn't.
So that's what inspired the guide to do the God Wizard.
Excellent. I like that you had the presence of mind to realize that you'd kind of overshadowed the other fighter.
I hate to interrupt, but
that's okay.
When you're overshadowing somebody else.
Yes.
You might ignore it, but And, everybody who overshadows somebody else, they know what they're doing. And it might be an inconvenient truth that they try to put aside, but if it's happening, they know it's happening.
See, I wished I would have had the maturity, because I had a similar experience to happen to me, although I was only 13 at the time, so I was very young. But the dungeon master kind of told me the same thing. I had like 3 different groups I played with a lot, right? And the one group, they really only played when we all got together, right? And it was, it was like I was in like Boy Scouts, so really we had a bunch of people from there who played with me all the time, but we were all from different schools because I lived out in the country, right? So everybody's scattered everywhere, and so we weren't all together at school. We were all in different schools. And then when we get together for Boy Scouts, we'd all play, but some of them only played when we went on camping trips, right? So we'd do whatever we were supposed to do during the day, and then at night we'd all build a giant lean-to, pile in, and we just play till like 3 in the morning with flashlights or lanterns or whatever, right? But I just wasn't really mature enough at the time. I kind of knew, and when my friend pointed it out to me, I felt pretty bad about it. But I wish I would have had that presence of mind. So,
well, at 13, I'm impressed you even felt bad about it. For me, at 13, D&D was a competitive game.
Yeah. All right, that's awesome though. That's a great starting point. So when you talk about like battlefield control, what kind of spells are we talking about specifically?
Well, okay, so we should probably talk about 5th edition, because that's what your viewers are generally going to be familiar with. And by far the biggest battlefield control spell you can cast is a spell that makes a wall. And I don't mean wall of fire. If you can walk through it, it's not a wall. But if you can do like a wall of stone or a wall of force, the ability to simply separate your enemies gives you a massive tactical advantage. And if you don't understand why, I mean, do a combat against 4 enemies, then do a combat against 2 of them, and another combat against 2 of them, and you'll see what I mean.
Yeah.
It's all about action economy, and basically you take their action economy and you cut it in half. So that's like the big one, but there are lower level spells that can achieve battlefield control as well, even if it's just changing the terrain. If it's sometimes blocking line of sight can make a significant difference. But in 5th edition, there's also a lot of effective ways to disable enemies. The really big ones are like when you get to 3rd level and spells like Fear and Hypnotic Pattern come into play. These are battle-changing spells. And again, they're not doing damage. But when you make half the enemy run away, it's just as effective as splitting them up. And even at 1st level, you cast a sleep spell and you take half the goblins and drop them on the ground. Mm-hmm. You're achieving the same goal.
All right, excellent. So I was wondering, if you look at like the 4 different tiers of play, right? Or tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, tier 4, right? How do you see the role of the wizard in each tier, and how do you see it sort of changing and evolving over time?
Yeah, to some degree, the role never changes. You're always going to be that character that takes enemies and you make them worse. That's your job. With 5th edition, my general advice to people today is, you can make an effective wizard that doesn't deal damage, but you're probably better off if you have some damage options as well and kind of mix them in, so you have a nice rounded character that can do many different things. But when you're 1st level, your job is to cast Sleep twice.
Yes.
Or 3 times after a short rest. That's your job. And when you are 5th level, your job is to Hypnotic Pattern, for example. You have more options, but Hypnotic Pattern or Sleet Storm. And when you're 11th level, then it's the Wall of Force. And then when you're 17th level, then it's the Force Cage and those kinds of things. So to some degree, your job never changes. You just get a lot better at it because of the way spell slots work. Not only do the tools become more effective, but you have more uses of them.
Yes. And obviously you're not saying never cast shield or absorb elements or anything else.
Oh, you should cast shield all the time.
Yes.
Shield is a must-have spell, even if you're not a wizard.
Yeah,
it's a must-have spell.
It really is, isn't it? There's a reason why, things like Eldritch Knights and Arcane Tricksters still remain good despite all the additional source books we get giving us more and more subclasses.
Yeah, that's one of the things that's not intuitive about D&D is that your wizard is probably your tankiest character. Just because there are so many defensive spell options for them that you can out-tank the barbarian because the barbarian has lots of hit points and can get resistance, but you cannot get hit in the first place.
Yeah. So are there any specific spells you like in each of these different tiers? I mean, obviously don't go through every single spell, but, maybe just your one or two favorites in each tier of play.
My favorites change because I can tell you what the best spells are. Like I said, sleep is a banger. When you get to third level, hypnotic pattern and fear are the big ones. Mm-hmm. When you get to fifth level spells, Big B's hand is huge. And of course, Wall of Force. And then you get to seventh level, Force Cage is massive. But what I find is, I've been playing for 8 years. 5th edition is I get bored of doing the same things over and over again. So I constantly, when I do play a wizard, I try to explore options that I haven't before. Because although Hypnotic Pattern is really powerful, it isn't my favorite anymore because I've overused it. To the point where now it's kind of ho-hum, right? Now I want to find that new option that, can I make the summon undead spell work for me or something like that, right?
Yeah. How to get the most out of Sickening Radiance or other similar spells,
That's right.
Yeah. I noticed, this was probably a couple months ago, because it was when I first started talking to you. You'd done a couple videos. One was your 50,000 subscriber celebration with some other YouTubers, and you did a 20th level one-shot. And then you followed it up with another video talking about just high-level play in general, and said that you actually thought that it worked fairly reasonably well, which has actually been my experience as well. I've run a few campaigns now that have gone all the way from 1 to 20, and as long as the players approach it with this mindset that they're not going to try to break the game with things like, infinite simulacrums and whatnot, then I thought it worked fairly well. So I was actually quite pleased to say you had sort of a similar experience. And I was thinking about the difficulty with wizards, because really, when we talk about high-level play, breaking the game, as good as a 30-foot aura on your paladin is, that's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about, rogues getting that 10th D6 on their sneak attacks. We're talking about Wish. We're talking about clones and simulacrums and, Force Cage and Maze and all these other things. So I was wondering if you had any advice for, that 4th tier of play particularly.
So you touched on the most important thing right off the bat. That is, you need to have a social contract between the DM and the players that if you have an option to cast the 7th level spell to cast Simulacrum and then have that Simulacrum wish another Simulacrum of you and so on and so forth, yes, you can wreck the game. Yeah. But you know what? There are earlier level options to break the game as well. It doesn't really matter what level play you have. You always need that social contract. And if you've gone ahead and made it to those high levels, assumably that social contract is already in place. It doesn't suddenly become null and void because you have more options to break the game. So I don't think that's going to be an issue unless you're doing a one-shot with players that you haven't played with before. If in that case, you always have the problem or the chance that there's a problem player. But in general, I don't worry too much about the social contract. I just assume it's in place. And then it largely comes down to, yes, wizards have some really outstanding spells. However, if you are a DM and you are understanding on how the game works, I find that can be easily evened out, smoothed out with those other features like that you mentioned. The Paladin 30-foot aura is a pretty big one.
Yes, it is a great advantage.
I don't want to trivialize that because it is game changing.
It is.
It's pretty reasonable if you're playing a 17th level character that you'll come across enemies with 3rd level spells. Dispel Magic is a 3rd level spell. Counterspell is a 3rd level spell. And if you get outnumbered by your enemies, you're not counterspelling all of them. Exactly. Legendary Resistance is a factor. A lot of creatures. I would even say maybe even most of them, though I'd have to actually pull it up, but I just off of memory, have some kind of teleport option by those high levels. So suddenly they might have a way out of your force cage, especially if they have legendary resistance. Yes. So, you can make it... you could shut down the wizard. You could shut them down entirely just by encounter design. You shouldn't, because that wizard still wants to have fun.
Agreed.
But what you can do is you can create additional challenges for them. That kind of even things out. And it's honestly not as hard as you would think. When I do high-level one-shots with patrons fairly regularly, and I find I don't have to think too hard to figure out what tricks do I want to make sure aren't just turning off this combat, right? Is Maze just going to win this fight? If Maze is just going to win the fight, then I probably need a way to fix that, because then they'll just cast Maze and it's over. Or I'm going to decide that fight's okay to be shut down with one spell. Yeah. But I go into the design knowing that that's a possibility, and if you do that, then it's really not that hard to adjust. I've run many, like, the reputation is that high-level games break down. I've run many one-shots that are high-level. I've run campaigns that have gone to level 20, multiple campaigns. And I have just never had it so that the game breaks down because of features that characters get or spells that characters get. It's just never happened. And so when I did that one-shot for the 50th or 50,000K celebration, it was kind of a no-brainer for me to do 20th level, because I knew it would work. I knew going in it was going to work out fine. I knew because it would be a disaster. I've got this channel on that has 5 to 10 times my subscriber rate. It's not easy to schedule these guys. Last thing I want is to run a one shot that halfway through suddenly breaks down. Yes. Right, and we're in the middle of recording and just lost that video. But I had no concerns at all. I knew going in it would work out fine, and it did.
Yeah, and you did a good job of making sure that every person had their moment to shine as well, which I think is very important in these type of games.
Yeah, I think you should do that regardless of what level you're playing at.
That's not wizard specific. That's just everybody should have a chance to be awesome.
If you are a DM and you don't know what characters necessarily the players are bringing in, maybe there's not a lot you can do for that. But if you do, then it doesn't take that long to look at each character and go, what moment can I give this character?
Yeah, I completely agree. So you touched earlier on things like legendary resist. I guess if we're talking about like tier 3, tier 4 play, this is a common thing that wizards have to run up against. And not just wizards, obviously any spellcaster runs into legendary resist. Do you have any advice for dealing with those kind of things?
Yeah, there's really two ways you can deal with legendary resistance if you're a spellcaster. The first is to try to burn them through. So you're going to cast and cast and cast until they have to use all 3 legendary resistances. Yes. The other possibility is to cast spells that don't provide saving throws. And I find the second is just way superior. Yeah. If I cast a summon spell, I don't care that you have legendary resistance. Obviously, if I have a force cage, I don't care that you have legendary resistance. Though I will care if you have legendary resistance and Misty Step.
Yeah. Or some other form of teleportation. Yeah.
That's right. If I have Big B's Hand or Telekinesis, I don't care that you have legendary resistance. Because those spells are opposed, but they're opposed by ability checks, not by saving throws. And legendary resistance does not work for ability checks.
Yeah.
So it's largely about spell selection. Like you have to do... now, often you'll be in these big fights at high level, and there'll be mooks right? And they won't necessarily have legendary resistance, so it's not that spells that provide saving throws are useless. But if you're talking about that big bad guy, he's going to have legendary resistance. Of course, they're going to have legendary resistance, and so you do have to think about it when you're planning your spells. Do I have some options for dealing with that? And the constant just spamming of spells is just too slow. Unless you have a group that's kind of combined on working that way, and you can do that with teamwork. Like, you have 4 spellcasters and they all agree they're going to burn these legendary resistance and then hit a big hard spell at the end. And maybe you have ways like Silvery Barbs or applying disadvantage or Eloquence Bards or whatever to ensure those failed saving throws. That actually can work, but you really have to work with the rest of the group. If you're just kind of making your character and you're making a wizard, I would never count on burning through legendary resistances.
I find it very inefficient as well, like you said. And plus, there's
I mean, I've seen players more than once who try that method over and over again, combat after combat, and they never make it. By the time they get through those legendary resistances, the fighters and Gloomstalkers, they've taken that creature down to 0 hit points already.
Or the fighter Gloomstalker multi-class.
Or the fighter Gloomstalker Echo Knight.
Yeah.
Bugbear.
With a couple levels of Paladin in there somewhere. Yeah, Bugbear, yes. That's always been my experience as well. It's a lot harder to go through. Plus, there's always a danger, too, at high levels that the thing won't just have legendary resist. It could also have magic resistance on top of that, making it even more unlikely.
There's lots of creatures that have a pretty good chance of making their save in the first place.
Yeah. Or they've got, 25 in whatever the relevant stat is, and then they're proficient on that save, so they're, at a plus 15 or something. And even when you look at I got a robe with a Magi and a Staff of Power, my spell save DC is awesome. And it's but he's got legendary resist and magic resistance, and that's actually a good save for him. Sorry, you just use the 7th level spell slot.
Yeah, that's another thing I should probably touch on, is that there's often the talk about having the different spells hit different saving throws so that you can try to hunt for the weak saving throw. Mm-hmm. I find that is tough too. Because there's guesswork. I mean, you can always guess intelligence might be their weak save, and that's not a bad bet. But in terms of just kind of going through spells, looking for the weak save, unless you know what it is to start with, that's not a good strategy either. It takes even longer than just trying to hammer your way through those legendary resistances.
Yeah, I prefer, like you already said, spells that don't give a saving throw in the first place are usually your safest bet. That's one of the things I love about Maze so much if we're talking high-level spells. It's an ability check to get out. There's no saving throw to prevent getting put in the maze,
Maze is certainly, in all likelihood, the most powerful 8th level wizard spell.
Yeah. I mean, Demiplane's good, but not necessarily combat-specific, obviously.
Yeah, a Demiplane is a very useful spell, but if you were talking about Demiplane can be game-changing too. I guess it depends.
Yeah.
But in terms of just straight, easy to use, then Maze.
Yeah, hard to go wrong with that. So I thought maybe towards the end of the video here, we could talk about... I know you've done some videos on the One D&D or D&D 1, whatever they're calling it at this point. I've done a few on it as well. I thought maybe we could speculate on what we think the mage classes will be getting, and we can talk a bit of sorcerer and warlock as well. But obviously, wizard in that group as well. And what do you kind of think? I mean, obviously, this is just all speculation here. We don't know, but
yeah. The first thing I'd say is I probably would have been more confident with guesses if you had asked me 2 months ago.
Yes,
than I am now, because what I have discovered with the playtest so far is it has gone in directions I didn't expect. One of the big things that I've noticed is they're taking the kind of the recognized must-have options and nerfing them. So we saw that most dramatically in this last playtest with Sharpshooter. would probably be the biggest case where we saw it. So we had a feat that gave you a -5 +10 option for ranged weapons, and they just flat out removed that.
Yeah.
They didn't replace it. They just got rid of. Well, I guess they replaced it with you can shoot in melee, but it's not replaced with the damage option.
Yes.
And then you look and you're like, well, how am I supposed to do damage with my ranged character? And then suddenly things that you didn't think were good become what's good. So, they give the ranger Hunter's Mark without concentration, and you think, oh, Hunter's Mark, that's so. And then you see that sharpshooter doesn't do what it used to, and then you go, well, Hunter's Mark suddenly looks a lot better.
Yes.
So it really has changed kind of the paradigm as to how damage is going to work for warriors. Now, we haven't seen the warrior playtest yet, so there could be all kinds of stuff in there that changes things again. But what it does do is it tells me that things that I didn't think were on the table are on the table. The other thing I see in the playtest is they're changing everything they touch. So the very first playtest showed us that. We got every race in the player's handbook. Now we have in this playtest, it's either going to be a new race or the race is gone, and they specifically say this race won't be used anymore. Mm-hmm. And every other race has had changes, every single one of them. Yeah. So they just change. Then we can have feats, and we have a lot of printed feats now in One D&D, and other than a few fighting style feats and the tough feat and the resilient feat, they basically changed 90 to 95% of the feats. And again, this kind of the most powerful stuff is all pulled back, and a lot of the weaker stuff is kind of given a boost, which I'm all for. I'm all for that stuff. But what it does do is it makes me really just totally unsure what to expect when it comes specifically spells.
Yeah. Like,
if they give spells the same treatment they gave races, I have no idea what the best spells are going to be in One D&D.
Yeah.
But what I do know is if they give them the same treatment they've given to feats, that spells are not going to be as good as they were. That the most powerful options won't be as powerful as the most powerful options in the current set. This could really change the whole idea of how much more powerful spellcasters are than non-spellcasters. That gap might get heavily reduced if that's the way they go. But with Wizards of the Coast, I never know, right? Because they've had some releases lately that I wonder if the design team has been sleeping. Like when I saw Spelljammer, I thought it was just such poor design, and this is the same company. So, these first two playtests have me hopeful that we might have an entirely new game and a better balanced game. Yeah. But they could screw that up at any moment. So it's really hard for me to guess. One thing I definitely wonder is what they're going to do with warlocks, because they've changed the way spellcasting works. Mm-hmm. Everybody's doing prepared spells and set number of prepared spells per spell level. So what are they going to do with warlock there? They could just have it the same as everybody else, but I can't see them doing that because it would be boring.
Yeah.
So I've had trouble speculating.
Different.
Yeah, and another thing I thought was happening or was clear before the playtest was I thought that features that you recover on short rests were going away, because we saw that in Monsters of the Multiverse with every single race.
Yeah, but everything now proficiency bonuses, time per day.
Now they have some features that used to be long rest features have become short rest features. Like there's the tireless feature for rangers.
Yeah.
In Tasha's, that's a proficiency bonus per long rest feature. And now it's a short or long rest feature, which is the opposite of the change I generally expected to happen. So it is so hard to guess what could be happening. I also wonder about Wizard spellbooks. Like, are Wizard spellbooks going to automatically have all the spells, or are Wizards going to have less options than the other casters now? Because that would be just a massive turnaround. I'm very interested to see these playtests, but to a large degree, it's hard to speculate at all other than I expect the unexpected.
Well, especially if meta magic remains mostly unchanged. Let's assume that it stays something similar to what it is now, right? Without wizards having an expanded spell list and whatnot, I mean, there's just almost no reason to choose one over a sorcerer then. So I have to imagine that they're going to maintain some sort of separation between the two, you know?
I've got to think, the wizards are going to get some goodies that we don't expect. Because if assuming that the spellcasting rules that we saw in this last playtest carry forward, the major drawbacks of playing a sorcerer are gone.
Yes. Yep. That was one of the things with sorcerers. You know, you got to like 13th level and realized you had 13 known spells.
It was very difficult to select spells for sorcerers, and once you made those selections, you were stuck with them until you leveled up, and then you could only change one of them. Same thing with warlocks too, to some degree, though it was a little less pronounced with warlocks because you're largely relying on Eldritch Blast, and you have so many fewer slots to actually cast spells with. If you're going to give sorcerers preparations exactly the same as wizards, then wizards need something else to differentiate themselves. And I'm not sure what that's going to be. I hope we don't end up with a case where wizards and sorcerers look basically the same except for meta magic.
Same here.
I'm moderately confident that won't be the case.
Same. Moderate is a cute word in that sentence, though. It's doing a lot of the heavy lifting.
Yeah. My stomach's in knots on each, because there's so many changes. It's going to be so easy to screw up. Yeah. I hope they don't, but we'll see.
Another thing, and not caster specific here, not mage specific, but I'm a little concerned. Like, I personally love multi-classing, right? One of the reasons I love it is because it really gives me a chance to kind of be creative and almost like create your own class, essentially, right? I like that you get to, mix and match and take what you like from this and combine it with that, and it's just a very creative process, But when I look at things like Jack of all trades being pushed back to 5th level, like, I would be really surprised if Action Surge stays a 2nd level ability, for example. Like, maybe it will, right? Maybe I'm wrong. But I kind of feel like they're trying to push some of those abilities back. I don't know if Hexblades are going to be attacking with Charisma right at level 1. You know what I mean? Like...
Yeah. I'm with you. I totally get what you're saying. I agree. I think Action Surge will be pushed back. I see exactly what you're saying, how they're pushing a lot of features back. Though with the Ranger, I noticed there's a pretty banger feature at level 1.
That's true.
But I won't be disappointed at all if multi-classing encourages a more even split between the classes you're multi-classing, rather than I'm a sorcerer, but I dipped this and I dipped that. That wouldn't disappoint me if because multi-classing in general is still going to be pretty good.
I agree.
I don't, and we haven't seen the multi-classing rules yet.
That's true.
Right? We have a tidbit. We know it's still there, and we have a tidbit of the requirements are obviously going to be similar. We saw they were basically the same for our 3 classes that we got. What they gave was basically the same. Rangers were better for multi-classing now in terms of spell casting.
But get spells at 1st level, so really just better.
But there could still be additional changes to multi-classing we haven't seen yet. Like how spellcasting classes acquire new spells. There still might be changes, because largely what they're doing with these playtests is they're making sure you can play them with your existing rules. So they might still have plans for changes we haven't seen yet.
That's true. Are you surprised that things have been as different as they are? Because they were kind of saying that it was going to be backward compatible, and there was basically going to be 5.
Yeah, that was a lie.
Yeah, that's been my impression as well. Also,
I don't know if it was a lie as much as just kind of misleading, because I do note that whenever they said, because they get quoted backwards compatible, but if you watch a lot of the segments where they talk about it, the example they always use is the same. They always say, if you want to run Curse of Strahd, you'll still be able to run Curse of Strahd. And you will still be able to run Curse of Strahd. But in terms of actual like player option content being backwards compatible, it's clearly not.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's an interesting observation. Any thoughts on the future of Counterspell?
Well, there's no way they're going to keep it the same.
No.
It's way too unpopular for them to keep it the same. So it will absolutely change if they don't get rid of it entirely. I don't think they'll get rid of it entirely. Like I know people will say, but it's on the list they showed in the last playtest. But again, these playtests are presented to work with your current rules. Yeah. So the spells are identical to your current list. Other than Eldritch Blast is conspicuously missing because we know it's 100% going to be a Warlock feature rather than a cantrip. We all know that. But every other spell, it's the same list. Do we think they are not going to introduce any new spells and they're going to keep every old spell? I certainly don't. Yeah, this is why what you see right now is what you currently have, but I wouldn't expect that to necessarily remain the same.
Yeah.
And there was somewhere I was going with that, and I've forgotten what it was.
That's all right. That's all right. Well, and people need to remember, too, that, it's not like this is this, new edition, we might as well just call it, it's coming out next month or something. We're still a couple years out. So, I mean, they could change almost anything or everything between now and then.
And they did say, like Jeremy Crawford has said specifically, this won't even be the only expert classes document we see.
Yes.
What they're going to do is after they release everything, then they're going to go back and they're going to start again, and they're going to release the next version that has taken the survey into account, meaning that your viewers should absolutely fill out the survey if they care about what One D&D looks like. Mm-hmm. So what we've seen now and what we see when the actual player's handbook comes out might be very different things.
Yeah.
My general assumption is One D&D will be better than 5th edition. That's my general assumption because I think that every edition kind of brings something to D&D that it hasn't had before, has been ultimately good for the game. I even think 4th edition ultimately was good for the game. Not necessarily a better edition than 3.5, but ultimately good for the game. I think One D&D will be good for the game as well.
Yeah. And, I mean, to go back to something you kind of mentioned previously about how, we don't know what the fate of casters is going to be and the balance between melee types or martials, not necessarily melee, sorry, I should have been more specific, but martials and casters could be closing. But, I mean, in general, that's probably a good thing. I also... Yeah,
now the other option is that it is going to be a bigger gap than ever. Which
too.
Also is entirely possible.
Well, especially because with the nerfs of sharpshooter. And even
that's right.
Mastery,
That's right. In fact, that's the common opinion right now, is because we've seen the nerfs to the most powerful options for weapons, mm-hmm. and we haven't really seen spells. So, you if you take the puzzle that is currently incomplete, and then you just fill it in with 5th edition, then the martial caster divide is bigger than it has ever been, and
maybe since 2nd edition.
Yeah, and but we just don't know, right? Yeah. There's no way the rest is going to be the same as it is in 5th edition. So, in terms of the martial caster divide, it's currently an open question.
Yes. And also to go back to one of my previous comments on multiclassing there too, as much as I love multiclassing, I think we'd both agree that multiclassing it's actually just too good of an option right now. Like, I feel like straight class builds should also be a viable option, So even though I personally
ideally multiclassing should take a straight class and allow you to change the theme, rather than allow you to just make it better.
Yeah.
And if they can achieve that, that's a difficult design. Like our expectations are often really high, the game design is maybe not as easy as a lot of people think it is. because it's really easy after 8 years of play to look back and go, well, they obviously shouldn't have done that. Yes. Well, they know that too. But when you're in the design room and nobody's played before, the thinking of every interaction isn't so easy. But if they can achieve a multi-class where it's just a thematic change, but it's ultimately similarly balanced to going straight class, I'd be absolutely thrilled.
Same here. Well, the other thing is, too, that sometimes you just need time to figure these things out. Like, I remember, I'm sure this is a point you'll probably agree with, because I know you're quite legendary for this stance. But when I first started playing 5th edition, we had a monk at our table, and I thought the monk wasn't particularly well optimized either, so that's going to be another factor here. But I personally thought monk was kind of garbage. And I remember going on the internet and kind of expressing that opinion on some message boards and being widely flamed. But you look at it now, and the monk hatred has gone completely the other direction. Right? Like nobody thinks monks are good for anything these days, right? And it's kind of
there's a small contingent that still defends them, but
they do have subclasses that aren't so bad. We can both agree on that. But my point is that what people originally perceived as being pretty good, in the course of time, as people have played it more, they start to realize maybe it's not so great anymore. And things that we maybe thought were a little weak, like I just recently did a video on the Order of Scribes Wizard, which I personally think is pretty decent, right? But it's one that, again, got a lot of hatred at the beginning, and people have kind of come around more on it now as they've had a chance to play it more. So we really don't know how this stuff is going to shape up, because a lot of times one campaign or one trial run or sitting down with some buddies and doing a test drive of the new rules, it's not really the same as thoroughly testing something, playing every week or multiple times a week for years. It just isn't.
Yep. And you got to remember the designers don't have time machines. They don't know how things will shake out after every, because they have a very limited number of people with a limited amount of time. And then once they make it public, then you've got hundreds of thousands of people with years and years to pour through every little option. People like me going in and looking for every little tweak that you can get something out of. And we will absolutely, once again in One D&D, come up with things that they didn't expect.
Like, I think we can probably look at the changes to sneak attack, and we can probably infer that they weren't expecting rogues to use sneak attacks as reactions that much. You know what I mean? They certainly weren't expecting you to, like, hey, what if I took Sentinel and I could use this to attack as a reaction plus my minute?
That was 100% unexpected for them. When they said it could be used once a turn, they figured that meant once a round.
Yes.
And then we found a way to make sure it wasn't once a round. So now they've changed it so it is definitely once a round. However, I absolutely despise that a rogue can't hold their action and attack and get a sneak attack. I hope that changes.
Same here. Because even in a non-optimized group, that is something that comes up a lot. Like I've got some players who, until recently had never multi-classed, even though we've been playing for years. They, they'll take like sharpshooter and stuff like that, obviously, right? But they're not really, necessarily, like some of the players are more along the optimization route, but some of them aren't so much, right? They're a little more casual, But, if you're sitting there with your, with your rapier and you want to sneak attack, but you've got 20 decks and the alert feat, and then the paladin dumped decks because he's wearing plate mail, and you realize, oh, if I run in and stab him, I don't have advantage, and I don't have an ally within 5 feet. So I'll just hold my action until the paladin goes, then I'll have an ally within 5 feet. Well, now you can't sneak attack on that,
Yeah.
And that has nothing to do with optimization. That's just a simple factor that I need to meet these criteria to be able to sneak attack. Yeah. And now, in order to meet those criteria, I actually can't sneak attack.
We're not closing a loophole here. We're just screwing over the rogue.
Yeah. Exactly. And I get that, maybe they weren't expecting the rogue to dip, Battlemaster Fighter and grab Action Surge and have her post and, brace attack and all these other things, right? But at the same time, you should be able to play a rogue. I mean, I guess on a ranged rogue it's not so bad because you could take, like, the aim feature, right? You know, and just aim with your range attack, give yourself advantage, and then you can still sneak attack. But
which aim feature?
Well, the one from Tasha's, if it stays the same, I guess.
Yeah, I wouldn't be counting on being able to use previous stuff if it's not backwards compatible.
True. And I believe it's an optional rule anyway, so who knows, you know.
My general expectation is most groups are going to abandon Tasha's and Xanathars and such when the new player's handbook comes out.
Yeah, that's actually a very solid point. Because, I mean, maybe they'll give us some new version of that when the player's handbook comes out. Like maybe rogues will just get that, but they didn't get it in the playtest. They didn't get it.
Yep. And they clearly weren't ignoring the optional class features because the Ranger basically has got them all, and and the old features are all gone, right? So it's not like they weren't mindful of using the Tasha or the Tasha's optional class features in designing these classes. Yeah, so it looks like steady aim is gone on purpose.
Yeah. And like I said, you know, if you can't hold your action and sneak attack, then, I mean, you know, that's just one less reason to play Rogue. And honestly, I don't have a lot of strong reasons to play Rogue anyways, at least not as my, like, core... I don't know.
I know I will be filling out the survey, and I'll be explaining to them that I don't mind only being able to sneak attack once per round, but I want to be able to hold my action, and I hope lots of other people do, and then they will listen.
I'm hoping so as well. And to their credit, they have done a pretty decent job of looking at player feedback and incorporating that sometimes. Sometimes no, but I mean... they're a lot better than a lot of, like, say, video game companies are at incorporating user feedback. So, I mean, I guess there's that.
Well, I mean, there was a time when they didn't care about feedback at all. Like, 4th edition wasn't based on player feedback.
That is true.
Yeah. So, I'm encouraged that they're actually asking for feedback. And apparently, when they come out with the next version of expert classes... Jeremy Crawford will be doing an interview where he discusses how they've incorporated player feedback. So, you need to let them know if there's things that you don't like.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think that probably wraps everything up. I've had you for longer than I originally had tried to book you for, so I apologize for that. And we started late, which was also my fault. So, and then my camera didn't work, so also just a complete gong show on my part. So, you know, all bad on me, so I apologize for that. But
no worries.
I do appreciate your time. I appreciate the conversation. I thought it was a good conversation once we actually started having it, so that's at least a positive. But yeah, I really appreciate your feedback on a lot of this stuff. Like I said, you're a very knowledgeable player. I really enjoy your channel as well. So, you know, for the 5 people who have subscribed to me and not subscribed to Treantmonk, please go to his channel. I'll have a link to it in the video description for the, you know, for my mom or whoever else needs it.
All right. Thank you very much.
Yeah.